Hey everybody, Attorney Somm here. Welcome back. I recently had the opportunity to attend a Bordeaux Entrepreneur event for the 2020 vintage in which I evaluated a number of the barrel samples for the 2020 vintage. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing my thoughts regarding the 2020 vintage in Bordeaux, and be sure to stick around at the end because I'm going to be making some recommendations concerning how wine collectors can best play this particular vintage. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Entrepreneur system, be sure to go back and check out my last video in which I explained the Entrepreneur system and provide an overview of what it's all about. We're going to start out by talking about the weather for the 2020 vintage, as that's always very important for Bordeaux. 2020 was a vintage with lots of extreme weather. There were a bunch of hailstorms early on. The hail obviously has a tendency to damage the grapes and to reduce the yields. And in fact, yields are down about 10% in Bordeaux compared to the 2018 and 2019 vintages. Then there were a number of torrential downpours in June, and this tended to cause some mildew issues, particularly for the Merlot. And so some Merlot crops would probably suffer some yield issues due to these heavy rains in June. After these rains, there was a period of intense heat. During this intense heat, some of the younger vines struggled, and certainly the soils that didn't have good water holding capacity struggled as well because they were short on water and experienced drought conditions. And then later in September and October, there were heavy rains again, and this was problematic for those who didn't pick their late ripening grapes before the rains began. So the late ripening grapes would include Cabernet Sauvignon and Petit Verdot. Dry white wines were generally okay because those white grapes were harvested in August, well before the rains came in September. Likewise, Merlot is an early ripening grape, and so that was usually safely harvested by mid-September, before the rains in the third week in September. So what does this all mean for collectors? Well, first, you're going to have to be very, very selective in the 2020 vintage. You can't just generalize and say it's solid across the board. There were specific issues relating to storms and downy mildew and bad weather that could have hit specific producers just depending on their location and the way the vintage played out. Many of the red wines are also extremely tannic. I can tell you from experience from tasting these wines are most likely going to need a fair amount of age before they're ready to enjoy. Based on my evaluation of the wines and my research and analysis, I have 4 recommendations for collectors for the 2020 Bordeaux vintage. First, it's important to be selective and do your homework. Make sure you do the research for each particular producer whose wines you may purchase, and make sure that they didn't have any particular issues that caused problems in 2020. Second, you're most likely to find outstanding wines in the right bank, where there's a high percentage of Merlot, particularly Pomerol and Saint-Emilion, especially on the plateaus where they have excellent drainage and didn't have many problems with mildew and fungal diseases during the rainy seasons. On the left bank, you're going to want to look to Pauillac and then also Saint-Julien, especially for the producers that are close to the river, as these tended to do fairly well also during the 2020 vintage. For example, I tasted the Baillecheville, and that was showing pretty well. It was also about 45% Merlot. And lastly, if you're not sure about a particular producer, or if the prices seem too high, I would probably just pass on the Entrepreneur or the Future system and wait and evaluate the wines after they're released to the market. As mentioned earlier, these are going to be some pretty tannic wines, and you're going to have some time to purchase them in the secondary market before they're ready to enjoy. The other thing that should be noted is that these scores from the critics for the Entrepreneur wines are oftentimes not even based on the final blend for the wine that's ultimately bottled. In many instances, the producers don't finalize the blend until 12 to 18 months after Entrepreneur. And for that reason, typically the samples are just the best guess of the producer as to what the final blend may be. If you're basing your purchasing decision on a score from a critic who's not even tasting the final version of the wine, that's a pretty speculative proposition. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next one. I come out with weekly wine videos. Until then, drink well.